An American founding father whose name you well know wanted Canada even before there was a United States. It was not to be, but it offers lessons for today. Hi everybody, I'm Steve Paikin and welcome to Campbell House in downtown Toronto. This place might have been familiar to early settlers of a contested colonial town in the 17 or 1800s. We're here for a close-up edition of TVO Today Live with author Madelaine Drohan. This series is possible thanks to the very generous support from the Wilson Foundation and its benefactor, Red Wilson. Madelaine Drohan is a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa and author of He Did Not Conquer, Benjamin Franklin's forgotten failure to annex Canada. I'm holding it in my hand as we speak, with the man on the $100 bill looking very pensively back at us. First of all, welcome. It's so nice to meet you, my fellow Hamiltonian. Okay. Ben Franklin had his sights set on this place a long time ago.
Yeah.
And how come people don't know this?
There's a long answer to that and maybe a short answer.
Start with the short answer and then
Okay.
we'll build.
We don't talk about it. I mean, when you think about it, history is what we choose to remember, and enough of us have chosen not to remember this that it doesn't sort of form part of our collective memory. And that's why people are shocked about it right now.
We're here in Campbell House, which is one of the oldest buildings in this capital city of Ontario. It's more than 200 years old. And even though it is very old, your story actually predates this place. When we say Canada of the 1700s, what are we actually referring to?
We're mostly referring to what we consider now the province of Quebec, the southern part of the province of Quebec along the St. Lawrence River. At the time, in the early 1700s, it was called New France or Canada. It was under the French regime and basically peopled by French Canadians. When we get on a bit later, after 1760, it became a British colony, but still it was mostly populated by French Canadians. And at the time, which I know we'll get to around the American Revolution, most of the population in Canada, or the province of Quebec as it was then called, again, it was concentrated between Montreal and Quebec City. In Toronto, there was no Toronto at that point. There was a Fort Toronto, which was a French fort that it was where the exhibition grounds are now. And of course, the First Nations had, settlements here much longer than that. But there was no other presence here at the time.
So let's go to 1776 then. You've described what Canada essentially was at the time.
Right.
13 American colonies at that time. They're not yet, let's go, pre-signing of the Declaration of Independence. They're
Right.
not yet a country.
Right.
What kind of a place is it? Who are the people? What's their religion? What's their makeup? How many are there, etc.?
Those are a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Okay, we're talking about the 13 colonies.
Yeah.
Okay, well, they were all British colonies. They were predominantly, but not exclusively, English-speaking Protestants. I mean, who had come over, the original ones had come over from the British Isles, and then the population just boomed in the 13 colonies. So when we get to 1776, I think there's probably about 2.5 million, around that, as population estimates aren't great, but 2.5 million British American colonists. There might have been about 100,000 French Canadians in Canada or the province of Quebec. There might have been about 2,000 English speakers in the province of Quebec. And then there'd be tens of thousands First Nations in that general area where the two sort of intersect. And I should mention as well, there were separate colonies for Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and what they called the Isle of St. John, which is now Prince Edward Island.
Isle of St. John?
Yeah.
Okay. The European settlement of this part of the world, I guess we trace back to what, about the 17th century roughly?
They started coming over in the 1500s.
In the 1500s, but
Yeah.
like Jonestown, 1600s,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right.
Indigenous people, of course, long, long before.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of that.
Yeah.
Talk about their presence in this part of the world prior to Canada, prior to the United States.
The indigenous population. Okay, I don't have figures for that, but of course there would have been rather large nations, we'll call them First Nations, both throughout what was the 13 colonies and Canada. There was a difference between how the British settlers interacted with them and the French settlers, in that the British settlers were basically here to settle, as in the name, you know, so they were taking over territory and pushing the First Nations out, whereas the French settlers were coming over. There was not as many of them, and they were here to trade, and so they needed to have sort of a mutually beneficial arrangement with the First Nations. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it was their sort of economic circumstances that controlled how they interacted with the First Nations. And both the English and the French settlers tried to have the First Nations as their allies.
Let me pick up on that. How did their influence in the colonial wars affect Benjamin Franklin's view of Canada?
Well, certainly at the beginning, when and we're talking, this is prior to the Revolution,
yes.
when Franklin was growing up, let's put it then, because then it was a French regime in Canada and versus the British American colonies, and both sides with their Indigenous allies would raid the other side. And so when Franklin was growing up in Boston, the papers would be full of stories about raids of French raids with their Indigenous allies coming down, burning settlements, taking hostages. I mean, this was a fairly common thing. It was well covered in sort of the newspapers of the day. And so not just Franklin as he was growing up, but you know, the colonists there saw Canada as a threat to their security.
And Franklin would have noticed that and presumably be influenced by that.
Absorbed it. It was part of his thinking, yeah.
Okay. Ben Franklin today, to the extent that I suspect Canadians think of him, they know he's the guy on the $100 bill. Mm-hmm. They know he's the guy who flew the kite and had some relationship with electricity. Lightning rods, bifocals, all of that. You've zeroed in on one of the ironically less successful projects of his life, which is his repeated attempts, not once, but repeated attempts to make Canada part of the United Colonies of America. All right, let's dive into this a little further now. I like to think I know a bit about this time of history. I knew nothing about that aspect of the story. How did you find out about it?
Well, I was in Montreal. This was when I was still writing for The Economist. I was on assignment. I had some time to kill. So I went around the block, and there's a museum there called the Chateau Ramsay, which is a lovely museum. And it's in a building that was built in the early 1700s. It's a museum of Quebec history. So, you know, I'm wandering around through the displays, and they have lots of religious artifacts and stuffed beavers and canoes and that, everything you'd expect. And then in a room at the back, they have this huge portrait of Benjamin Franklin. And I was just taken aback. I thought,
I'm thinking, what's that doing here?
Yeah, like, okay. So I went and looked at it, and they do have a little plaque on the wall there that said, Benjamin Franklin was in this very building in 1776 when he invited the French Canadians to join the American Revolution. And I was stunned.
You hadn't heard that before?
I had absolutely no idea. And I mean, I thought I was a relatively well-informed person, and this, I had no idea about it. And that sparked my interest in, you know, researching it, finding out exactly what had he been doing in Montreal. And the second part of it was, why don't I know about it?
Well, pick up on that, because if you didn't know about it and I didn't know about it, I'm going to assume a lot of people out there didn't know about it either. And the question is, why not?
Okay. And it's because nobody talks about it. Okay? And you go through the list of players that were around at the time, because I should backtrack a little bit and say one of the attempts was Franklin actually did come to Canada when the Americans invaded and occupied Montreal and Trois-Rivières.
What year are we talking now?
We're talking 250 years ago right now. And he arrived April 29th, 1776, and he left May 11th, 1776, okay? So anyhow, so that was one of his attempts, and that whole invasion fell apart. It was a complete failure, but it was followed right afterwards by the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so the Americans, even at the time, didn't want to talk about it much because it was at such a sensitive point in the American Revolution. Bad for morale. They tried to conquer Canada and they failed. Okay? Franklin hardly ever referred to it again in his writing. I could find like maybe 3 references over the next 20 years about it. So he wasn't interested in talking about it. And it doesn't fit with the American founding myth, you know, which is
success.
Well, success, but also we're victims of British tyranny, we're just defending ourselves, Britain was the aggressor. Well, it doesn't really look good if you know, started out by trying to conquer the colony next door. So for a number of reasons, and also they've got something to celebrate with the Declaration of Independence, which sort of pushes everything else that came before that into the shade.
Yeah, it becomes the story.
Yeah, yes.
You're a journalist.
Yes.
You know what the story
Exactly.
is. The Declaration of Independence is the story,
Yeah.
not some failed battle that didn't
With
work
Canada.
out for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, so you can understand it. But so the Americans, you know, tend not to talk about it in their history books, in their popular media. And we consume so much American culture here that, you know, we're influenced by that view, that it wasn't important.
But why wouldn't we trumpet that more, particularly since with all of the Trump annexation talk, it's so strange. Like nobody that I recall hearing about, I don't recall anybody saying, you know, you guys tried this 250 years ago and failed, now you're trying again, and we're going to kick your butts back to Washington again.
Yeah.
Nobody said that.
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, again, because we don't talk about it for reasons of our own, okay? If you look at the players, we'll take the French Canadians first, okay? So if they had risen up and supported the American invaders, it would have been all over. There were 100,000 of them, right? And some certainly did support them, but a lot of them were neutral and some of them supported the British, right? Okay. At first there were some attempts to sort of trumpet that whole thing, but then that fell by the wayside. And if you think about it now politically, it's not really a good look for a French Canadian to say, yes, I supported the British, you know? And more to the point for them, the big event in their lives was the conquest, when Britain pushed France out of North America. I mean, that's what turned their lives upside down.
Plains of Abraham.
Yes, exactly.
1759.
Yeah. So, you know, for them, you know, collective memory is a funny thing. If you're looking at one thing, you're not seeing something else. And so for them, they look at the conquest. So again, this is not as important to them, even though it was hugely important to Canada, it's not necessarily important to the French Canadians, you know, as a group. And the English Canadians just weren't around at the time.
So there's all sorts of kind of reasonable reasons why members of both of our countries don't particularly want to remember this time in our collective history.
No, it's true, and there's probably another one that we should mention, which is, you know, at the political level, does the Prime Minister of Canada really want to go around poking the President saying, you know, you lost, especially this Prime Minister and this President,
Yeah.
you know? So it's another reason to not put too much emphasis on it.
Although there comes a time in every Prime Minister's tenure when they jokingly say to some American president, you know, if you don't give us this, we're going to come down and burn down the White House again like we did 200 years ago.
Yeah.
But this is not the time for that kind of comment.
Probably not.
Okay, I get you. Why would Franklin have been so interested in, you know, given what was going on in the 13 colonies at that time, why would he have been so interested in trying to acquire what was then pre-Confederation Canada
Right.
for the United States?
Right. Well, a big part of it was security all the way along. I mean, Franklin didn't sort of start out by coming to Canada and try to turn around the invasion. He started out intellectually, painting out the reasons why Canada should be part of the United States. And the big one of those reasons was, of course, security when the French were in Canada, because get rid of them and then the 13 colonies don't have to worry so much about being attacked from the north. But he also had these other ideas about how it was the destiny of the British American colonists to occupy the whole continent.
Manifest destiny?
Exactly. I mean, the term wasn't invented for another 100 years, but that was the idea. And he also, there was a financial interest as well, that, you acquire more of the lands to the north, the land speculators can come in. He was a land speculator like many of the founding fathers. But I think, overall, I'd have to say security is the big one that, they just thought it'd be better if they owned the whole top of the continent and didn't have to worry anymore.
Is it always a real estate play with these folks?
Yeah. Well, that was another surprise to me, how many of them were involved in land speculation companies at the time, which covered as well. We don't think about this as part of Canada, but at the time of the American Revolution, that land below the Great Lakes in a sort of a triangle, that was considered part of Canada or the province of Quebec by both Britain and France. It's just the British American colonists who thought it really should be part of their territory.
Historians love to think about the what-ifs. Mm-hmm. So I presume at some point during the course of writing the book and now out promoting it, you have asked yourself the question, what if Franklin had been successful? Mm. What if he had managed, on behalf of those colonies, eventually the United States of America, to capture whatever Canada was back then? How would the last 250 years have been different?
Well, there were two times that he came close, okay? And so one of them would have been that invasion in 1776 when he came up to Montreal. He was supposed to be setting up a government. The Americans came very close to actually having all the major population centers in Canada. So the what if there is, we don't know if Britain would have mounted a counterattack after that and taken it back. Mm-hmm. We just don't know that.
So we could have become Americans.
We could very easily become the 14th colony, as they were talking then. But the second time, the other attempt of his was when he was negotiating the peace deal in Paris, when he tried to get Britain to give them the United States, Canada.
And that was in 1782. 82, okay.
Yeah. And that one would have been different, because if Britain actually signed a treaty and said, yes, Canada belongs to the new United States of America, then it's unlikely they would have mounted any sort of attack to take it back. So that would have been more sort of conclusive, and we really would have been Americans at that point.
So the odds were actually against what ended up happening. Two more likely scenarios would have been us to become Americans for two different reasons. Yeah. It's kind of, maybe it was our manifest destiny not to be Americans. You ever think of that?
I hadn't thought of that, actually. I think, at any time during the last 250 years, the Americans have certainly had the military power and the population and economic weight to take Canada over. But I think what saved us a lot of times is they wanted something else more at the time. In the peace treaty in 1782, when they were doing the negotiation, what they really wanted at the time was, or what the negotiators wanted more, was access to the fisheries off the East Coast and that land below the Great Lakes. They wanted it sort of set in stone that belonged to them. If they hadn't been preoccupied by that, I don't know. They would have gone for Canada.
So Quebec was back burner at that point then?
Yeah. They've always wanted Canada, they just always wanted something else more.
Huh. How much, this is a bit of an uncomfortable question to ask, but Franklin may have been typical of his time in as much as he didn't love Catholics. Mm. And we were very Catholic back then.
Yeah.
How much of his desire to take over Quebec was based on his dislike of Catholics? or distrust maybe.
Yeah, I think for him it would be distrust, although you have to remember he got over that when he went over to France and dealt with the very Catholic king of France. He was less a sort of anti-popery, as they called it at the time, than some of his colleagues like John Adams, for example. So yeah, I'm not sure that his dislike of Catholics came into it as much as just fear that because it was a different religion, different type of government, that it posed the security threat.
Well, and you do make the good point that he was negotiating with the French to try to come on side and help them beat the British to become an independent country.
Yeah.
So his dislike of Catholics didn't hold him back from doing that.
No, no.
Right. Would it be too cheeky to put forward the proposal that to some extent the way Britain kept Canada helped the cause of the American Revolution?
In 1760 now, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, no, absolutely. I don't think it's cheeky at all because, you know, you think about it. Britain has then removed an external threat from the colonies when they drove the French out of that part of North America. And so then the colonies could start concentrating on their grievances with the motherland. It gave them the freedom to start looking at that relationship and what they didn't like about it. As long as they needed Britain to come, you know, with their military forces and fight against the French, then they pretty much had to, you know, get along with them.
I don't hear Trump thanking us for that.
I'm not sure he thanks us for anything, to tell you the truth.
Tell us more about Franklin's time in Montreal.
Well, he had been sent up to Montreal by the Continental Congress to turn the invasion around and to set up a new government. And they got there, they left New York on April 2nd. It took them till April 29th to actually get to Montreal. And they were only there a couple of days when they realized they could not salvage what was going on. The American army was Continental Army was in disarray, deeply in debt.
Who was leading it at the time?
Well, there were a couple of generals. There was Benedict Arnold was still a general, and he was in control of Montreal when Franklin arrived. But there was also a General Wooster, who I think had taken over the siege of Quebec City, because that hadn't fallen. But the Continental Congress had sent their army up without enough provisions or money, and the French Canadians initially were happy to sell them things, but when they had hard currency, gold and silver, but as soon as they ran out of that and tried to pass off their new paper continental currency, the French Canadians started to say no, and then the army started to seize things. So they basically succeeded in turning the French Canadians against them at this point. And I think Franklin and his colleagues saw that, and they realized that without more money, they were going to, they desperately needed more money, more men, more equipment, more provisions, and they kept writing these begging letters to the Continental Congress about this, you know, send money, send pork, send powder, you know. And they were in the midst of all of this when on May 6th, British warships appeared in the St. Lawrence outside Quebec City.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Carrying reinforcements. So they had won the race to get reinforcements there. The American troops that were besieging Quebec just fled. They started running down, you know, towards Montreal and home. And Franklin and his colleagues found out on May 11th that the British had arrived, and he left Montreal that same day.
Do we know whether he was happy to leave Montreal, or was it his preference to get more reinforcements up there and continue the fight?
I think he wanted the reinforcements, but personally I think he wanted out of Montreal. Keep in mind, he was 70 years old. His health wasn't great. It looked like a problem that would require a great deal of time and energy to solve. And at this point, he just wanted to head home.
Did he speak French?
I think he spoke some French. He certainly wasn't as bilingual as some people thought he was. I imagine that once he got to France, he improved quite a bit, but during the time in Montreal, no.
All right, let's go to 1783. The Treaty of Paris is being negotiated. America is now, of course, a country, has been for a few years. They decide on various borders of various countries at the time. What did Franklin think about what was achieved at the Treaty of Paris?
I think he wasn't totally content, but he thought that that was all that they were going to get at that time. During the negotiations, which was, he was involved in the 1782 negotiations. I mean, that's when he was repeatedly asking that Britain give Canada to the United States. But then he fell ill. And so the end of the negotiations was left to John Jay and John Adams. And they were the ones who wanted fish off the East Coast and the land underneath the Great Lakes. So he basically had to content himself with that. And actually, there is one letter that he exchanged with John Adams after the treaty was signed, where he suggested maybe opening it up again and getting Canada, the secession of Canada, in there. So he hadn't totally given up, but you know, by this point, he really is an old man.
We should chat for a moment here about a word we would not use today, but I guess they did back then, his illegitimate son.
Oh.
Can you talk to us about the guy who eventually became the governor of New Jersey, William Franklin?
Yeah. Nobody knows who the mother was, actually, but Franklin had a common law wife, Deborah, who they moved into together when he was still in Philadelphia. And she agreed to take in this son, illegitimate son, William. So they raised him as their own. And Franklin then, when he was sent to London to be an agent for the colonies, brought William along, and William, you know, was introduced into all the right circles and seemed to have a taste for the British aristocracy and worked his way up, and then he was appointed governor of New Jersey. But when the Revolution started, Franklin assumed that his son would sort of side with him against the British, and that didn't happen. And so they were basically estranged after that. He did apparently in his will leave his son, I think he had 20,000 acres of property in Nova Scotia, which, and he left his son that property, but nothing else of his fortune in the United States.
Ben Franklin owned property in Nova Scotia that he left to his illegitimate son, who sided with the British.
Yeah.
That's awfully generous for a guy you have no relationship with because he didn't join Daddy in the Revolution.
Well, maybe he thought that's now in a British territory beyond his reach, and so was basically worthless to anybody who was an American.
Do we know whether Franklin had considered the Revolution somewhat personally tarnished for him because his son opposed him in it? His son stayed loyal to the British.
No, I think Franklin was very convinced that he was right and that his son was deluded, you know. Franklin in his personal family relationships, it's another side of the man that needs to be explored, because he has this common law wife who he basically spends, 3 or 4 decades separated from her. I mean, this is not a close relationship. And so I don't know about his personal relationships with his family itself, that they were very close.
We're talking about events of obviously 250 years ago, but as you perhaps look at those events through a present-day lens, can we conclude that there are elements of American society that have never completely given up on the idea of having Canada be part of them?
Yes, I think we can conclude that. I think that's one of the big lessons from this story, is that this was the attitude of many leading Americans at the time of the creation of the United States, that they should own Canada. And that has sort of run like a thread through the American psyche. all the way through. It emerges from time to time. In the 1840s, there was this talk of 54-40 or fight, which was basically to get all the west coast of Canada. You know, so
54-40 was the latitude and longitude?
54-40 was the southernmost boundary of Alaska, and they thought that America should own everything from the border of California all the way up to that.
I bet they did.
Yeah, but no, that's one of the things I think that we need to take away from this, is that this has been sort of an ongoing preoccupation, not always at sort of top of mind, but that runs through the American attitudes towards Canada. And we shouldn't have been so surprised that all of a sudden it emerged again with Donald Trump. You know, we probably should have been a bit more prepared for that.
Do we have any, I mean, Donald Trump kind of cherry picks his history, right, when he makes a case. So do we have any reason to believe that he knows anything about this and would have used this as inspiration for his own desires on Canada?
No, I don't think we have any indication that he knows this story at all, sadly, you know.
Be good for publicity for the book if he did.
Yeah, people ask me when they see the book, they say, did you write this because of Donald Trump, you know? And I have to explain that I started the research in 2020. Even my supervisor at university thought it was a niche idea. You know.
Even though you, I think, rightly suspect that Donald Trump knew nothing about this, do you, I mean, when he started making advances on Canada and saying we want to make Canada the 51st state and, you know, make, I guess it was Justin Trudeau at the time, the governor of Canada. I mean, what did you make of all, given that you know this, you were one of the few Canadians who knew this story, what did you make of all that?
Well, I just assumed that, you know, it's part of sort of the broader character that you sometimes think of Americans, you know, their sort of sense of exceptionalism and entitlement and expansionism. You know, that is something that is part of the American spirit. You know, they talk about the frontier. If you look at how the United States grew, you can see that from the very beginning, they were expansionists. You know, they start with a strip of land across the Atlantic, and either by purchase or conquering or negotiating sometimes, they stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and they started to look north and south. So when I sort of heard him talking about this, yes, it reminded me of let's make Canada the 14th colony, but I also thought it fits in as well with the worldview that we hear so often from the States, you know? Let's go to the next frontier, which happens to be space at this point.
Should it not be a bigger part of our founding myths that we rejected on numerous occasions, including when Benjamin Franklin was undertaking his efforts, we rejected efforts to become part of the American Revolution. We did it over and over and over again. We're still doing it to this day. Yeah. And yet this whole part of history that you've written about doesn't really seem to occupy much of a place in our founding myths. Got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I see it, and of course I'm biased, but I see it as a foundational moment for Canada, for that very reason that at the time, the First Nations, the French Canadians, and the English speakers, like the Loyalists, made a choice. They did not want to be Americans. You know, it wasn't anti-Americanism, they just did not want the system that the Americans were proposing to them. And I think we should make that into something a bit more positive. You know, it was a choice. And because often anti-Americanism here is sort of portrayed as some sort of knee-jerk, envious response. But it wasn't that. It was at the time, we don't want the system that you're proposing. We're going to stick with ours.
We hear that all the time nowadays, right? We like Americans, we just don't want to be you. I mean,
Yeah.
This is essentially what the people who were living in these parts were saying 250 years ago.
Exactly. We've been saying it for 250 years and hoping at some point they're going to hear it.
Well, they're not going to hear it, but we should probably chant it louder, don't you think?
I'm sure.
Okay, tell me this. Canada Post has a stamp with Benjamin Franklin's face on it.
Yeah.
Why would they do that when he wanted to take over our country?
I looked into that. You know, it was sort of like willful blindness in a way. I think at the time, that was 1776, that was marking the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. At the time, stamps were a big deal. They were money makers for post office. So when I was looking at sort of the memos, the internal memos in what was in the post office department, I mean, part of it was they needed to come up with something that we could share with the Americans, that they could actually raise some money with these stamps. And they lit on Benjamin Franklin, and nobody pushed back hard enough because we don't talk about this part of our history.
Well, even Canadians have a kind of a kindly view towards this guy.
Yeah.
I mean, when we go to the States, we tend to get money with his face on it, right? I've been to Philadelphia. There's always just a ton of people around Franklin's final resting place because they want to pay homage to this guy who was a central part of the founding myths of the United States. On the other hand, you tell us in your book, he struggled with humility. He was a bit loose with the facts. He was a bit of a conspiracy theorist when he thought it might benefit him. He was a person who viewed the world through, sometimes, the lens of real estate speculation. He was a proud British subject until he wasn't. Was Franklin, therefore, perhaps more of a rogue and less of an admirable hero than history has painted him?
Well, I certainly focus in the book about his relations with Canada, and so of course he comes off badly from a Canadian point of view, but I think he was an impressive character and certainly more well-rounded in every sense of the word than you know, popular culture would have it. I think we like our icons, and certainly in the United States, to sort of almost be perfect. So if there's any little blemishes, like Franklin's love of the ladies or his love of fake news from time to time, those are sort of rubbed off so that you get this perfect icon to promote. And so I don't know on balance whether I'd say, you know, he was all good or all bad. He had elements of both, but he was certainly an impressive intellectual.
You had a view of him before you started doing this book, and you have a view of him now. How different are those two views?
My view after the book is a lot more negative because, of course, in the course of reading his writings and other people's writings, you uncover the human being behind the man, and it's not always very admirable.
Could you cut him a bit of slack in as much as he did what he did in the interest of creating a larger, what turned out to be the biggest, you know, you could argue the most important country in the history of the world, and he was there at the founding of it. He was just doing his job.
Well, so I'm not sure I could. I mean, that certainly formed part of it, but sometimes he was doing things that were not necessarily for the greater good, although he painted it that way. You know, sometimes it was just a fit of pique or something like that. So, okay, a tiny bit of slack.
Last question. History is written by the winners. History is not normally written by the losers. Given what you've uncovered here, who's written this version of history?
I think in the case of Franklin and Canada, the American version of that is the one that's sort of been triumphant. And that's partly, as I was saying before, because they're very good myth makers there in America. We could learn something from them, actually. And they've come up with this myth and these icons to go with the myth, including Benjamin Franklin. And they've got the heft with their cultural exports to persuade everybody else that that's what the story is. So as far as Canada and the United States, we've allowed them to write the history.
So this is your attempt to push back a little bit at the American myth-making that has really dominated the last 2.5 centuries.
It is, and it's also a call for us to get our act together and come up with a good counter myth, you know, so that we can tell our own story instead of allowing others to tell it for us.
Amen. Nice job. Can I just remind people the book is called He Did Not Conquer, Benjamin Franklin's Failure to Annex Canada. Madelaine Drohan, it's so great to have you here, and thank you very much for joining us on TVO Today Live.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks to the Red Wilson Foundation. We always love to give them their props for this series. It would have been impossible to do this without you. So thank you very much to the Wilson Foundation. You can see previous conversations in this series at tvo.org/TVO Today Live, or our YouTube channel, which is TVO Today. I'm Steve Paikin. So long from Campbell House in downtown Toronto.
TVO Today Live is made possible by the generous support of the Wilson Foundation.